Good morning, everyone. This is the fifth and the final in the series of the Chiyuv. And I was asked a question by one of our listeners, and I'd like to repeat it. He basically promoted the notion that perhaps everything we said was true regarding the Chazzan of yesteryear. You know, the Chazzan that said every word, and everyone basically fulfilled their obligation by virtue of the Chazzan. But today, especially in an Ashkenazic shul, if I can be very blunt, the Chazzan is a traffic light. It tells you when to stop and when to go. Everyone says all the davening on their own, with the exception, say, of Chazarat-Hashatz. So why do we even need the Chazzan? If that's the case, then maybe the Chazzan doesn't have the same rules and regulations that we've been talking about for the last 4 times. And I'd like to address that question because he's not totally off. But in order to address it, let's go back a step. The last Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, dealing with the laws of Rosh Hashanah, throws out the following statement, and this is the statement of the majority rule. Kishem sheshliach tzibor chayav, just like the leader of the congregation is obligated in davening, so too Kach kol yachid v'yachid chayav. So too, everyone else is obligated in davening. But Rabbi Gamliel says, no. Shliach tzibur motzi et harabim yedei chovatan. Actually, the Chazzan davens, and everyone else fulfills their obligation by virtue of listening to the Chazzan. In a word, the Gemara there says that their machlokes is not about someone who doesn't know how to daven. In that case, they all agree that the Chazzan can fulfill their obligation by you listening and ultimately fulfilling your obligation. What's called the Eino Baki. But the Baki, the one that knows how to daven, the majority rule says he does not fulfill his obligation by virtue of the Chazzan. And Rabbi Gamliel says, yes, he does. In a word, according to the Chachamim, the Chazzan only fulfills the obligation for the She'ino Baki. But according to Rabban Gamliel, even for the Baki. How do we paskin? We paskin basically like the majority rule, as we usually do. In other words, the Chazzan does not fulfill the obligation for those that know how to daven on their own, with the exception of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that he does. That's the Gemara, and that's the background to what I'm about to say. With that in mind, indeed, the Magen Avraham, in our topic, comes along and says a very interesting chiddush. On Ali, he says, this is what I think. The dafka bisbaneihem shaya shliach hatzibur motzir harabim yedei chova betfilah az haya yachid yachol la'akev deino asas shlucho shebe'al kocham. What we said yesterday, that you cannot have someone do something against your will, namely you have to have a chazan that you agree with, that's only if the chazan is fulfilling the obligation on your behalf. Mashe enkein ata, which is not the case today, ata with an ayin. Shekulam bekiyim, everyone knows how to daven on their own. They all hold their own siddur in their hands. Rachat shliach tzibur hu lapiyutim. The only thing that the shliach tzibur does is lead the congregation into piyutim, mainly in the Tana Tokef, V'chol Ma'aminim, etc. That's his whole job description. Afal pi shomer kadishu baruch hu, and even though he says he's the only one in shul that says kaddish, he's the only one that says baruch hu, still en kokach kpeda. And if you don't say kaddish and baruch hu, you still have a good davening. In a word, the Chazzan we've been speaking about is not the Chazzan. The Chazzan we've been speaking about is the guy that used to say every word out loud, and everyone fulfilled their obligation by virtue of that Chazzan. That's not the case today. The Chazzan today ultimately is a traffic light, and everyone davens on their own. Even in a Sephardic shul where he says every word aloud, everyone still davens on their own. And therefore, one person cannot stop a Chazzan from Chazzaning. Even a majority can't, because the Chazzan is not really a Chazzan. Ultimately, the Kaf HaChaim explains the point of view of the Magen Avraham and says, this is the pshat of Divrei Razal, this is the pshat of our sages, the sugya we started with, that the whole Chazarat-Hashatz was there in order to fulfill the obligation for those that can't daven, but those that already davened obviously fulfilled their obligation in their own silent Amida. That's the point of view of the Magen Avraham, so everything we said, you can basically throw in the garbage, because it's irrelevant, it doesn't apply to the Chazan of today. But the Kaf HaChaim disagrees. The Kaf HaChaim comes along and says that, with due respect, this is what we call the pshat. If you learn the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, that's exactly the pshat. But there are many, many reasons, al pi sod, namely based on Kabbalah, that says that Chazarat-Hashatz is very important. And indeed, in the time of the Arizal, he says, Nitna reshut legalot. We were able to actually go ahead and expose the reason to the entire world. And he says, whatever the reason might be, the tervayu tzrichi. We need both the silent Amida and what we call the Chazarat-Hashatz, what I like to call the public Amida, the Adarabba. And then he says, not only is that true, Chazarat Amida shel shliach tzibor hi gdola min halachash. the Chazarat-Hashatz is even greater and more important than the silent Hamidah, and he explains it based on Kabbalistic sources. And therefore, he brings the halacha, and therefore everyone has to listen to Chazarat-Hashatz in order to make the tikkun needed. That's only done by the Chazarat-Hashatz. And therefore he comes to the conclusion, and if we are correct, the Chazarat-Hashatz is so important, and it's even on a higher level than the silent Amidah, therefore, there's no difference today between the Chazan of today and the Chazan of yesterday. The Chazan of today does one thing everyone else doesn't do, the Chazarat-Hashatz. And since it's so important, everything we said applied. So how do we paskin? Do we paskin like the Magen Avraham, that really today the Chazan's not the Chazan because we all daven alone and the whole Chazarat-Hashatz is for the guy who doesn't know how to daven? Or do we paskin like the Kaf HaChaim, that no, the Chazarat-Hashatz has importance inherent in and of itself, even for the people that already davened? Well, I hate to break it to everyone, but we do paskin against the Magen Avraham on this. Not for Kabbalistic reasons necessarily, but that is the Psak Halacha. While the Shulchan Aruch begins and says in Simon Kaf Kof Dalet, namely 124, that we say Chazarat-Hashatz in order to help the person that doesn't know how to daven on his own, he does say, if everyone already davened and everyone already said the silent Amidah on their own and they know how to read, even so, that even so we say Chazarat-Hashatz, which is the custom in every single shul, with very small exceptions. No one accepted the point of view that was proposed by the Rambam only in his responsum, not in his halachos, and that is to cancel Chazarat-Hashatz today. And since we say it, obviously, either because of Kabbalistic reasons that the Kaf HaChaim says, or for the reasons that Rav Soloveitchik once said, and that is that the private Amidah is like a private Korban, but the public Amidah is like the public Korban, like the Korban Tamid Shel Boker v'Shel Ben Arbaim, or the Musafs on Shabbos and Yontiv that are brought for all the Jewish people. And therefore, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that when we have a Chazarat-Hashatz, yesh, like what do the congregation have to do? You're not going to do anything else. You have to listen and you have to say Amen. Namely, Chazarat-Hashatz is as important today as it was when people didn't know how to daven. If that's the case, then the Chazan is a Chazan. And since the Chazan is a Chazan, everything we said applies to the Chazan. The Chasam Sofer, by the way, goes a step further. And he says that the most important part of davening with a congregation, to daven in a minyan, is Chazarat-Hashatz. And therefore he says that this is Ikar Tfilah B'tzibur. Kimasha Yechidim Kol Echad Nitpalel B'fnei Atzmo Mikar Tfilat Yachid. The fact that we all daven at the same time, 10 people in a shul, that's a private davening. But Masha Echad Motzi Rabim Sem Mikar Tzibur. But when one person, namely the Chazan, is fulfilling the obligation for everyone during Chazarat-Hashatz, that's considered davening in a minyan. That's the climax of davening in a minyan. And to sum up, we paskin that today Chazarat-Hashatz is as important as it was in yesteryear. And therefore, since that's the way we paskin, and the halacha is you have to listen to Chazarat-Hashatz, the Chazan is still a Chazan. If the Chazan is still a Chazan, then he better be the right Chazan. And he better be the right Chazan. Even a minority can go ahead and say, we don't want this Chazan, as we discussed yesterday, and all the halachas that we've been discussing until now in this series apply. The Chazan is still a Chazan because Chazarat-Hashatz is still on the agenda.